Most people think the Jedi only ever trusted one weapon, the lightsaber, but that's not even close to being true. The Jedi often adapted, improvised, and even broke their own rules when tradition wasn't enough. And one of these weapons was so controversial, it got its owner excommunicated from the Jedi Order. The Jedi didn't always start with a lightsaber. One thing that's easy to forget is that the lightsaber wasn't the beginning of Jedi weaponry, and it certainly wasn't the only path they explored. Long before the modern Jedi Order, the ancient Jedi of Titan used Force-imbued swords, also known as Jedi katanas, and this is one of the cases where the weapon itself tells you how different the era was. These weren't energy blades, and they didn't need a power source at all. They were solid metal swords, forged while the smith actively channeled the force into the blade, permanently altering its molecular structure. What makes this especially interesting is that the glow people associate with these swords wasn't a consistent feature. Sometimes the force manifested as a lightning-like striations across the blade, sometimes as fire-like energy, sometimes as discoloration, and sometimes not visually at all. The glow wasn't cosmetic, it was a sign that the blade had been fully married to both its crystal and its wielder. This process was physically and mentally dangerous. A mistake could shatter the blade, the crystal, or both. The Jedi of this era were still experimenting with how the Force could be embedded into tools, not just channeled through them. With that in mind, you can see the experimentation in the evolution of Jedi weapons. Before the lightsaber was truly portable. When people talk about early lightsabers, they usually imagine something slightly clunkier than the modern saber. But the proto-sabers were far worse than that. The archaic lightsabers still used focusing crystals and emitted energy blades, but the technology of the time couldn't miniaturize a power source small enough to fit inside the hilt. So the solution was an external power pack, carried on the user's back, hip or belt, and connected by a visible cable to the hilt. That cable defined everything about how the weapon could be used. Techniques like saber throws or telekinetic lightsaber combat simply weren't possible, and even basic movement restricted by the tether. Operational time was limited as well, because even the larger external packs could only sustain the blade temporarily. What's fascinating is that later Jedi did experiment with reintroducing external power supplies into modern technology, deliberately trading mobility for a stronger power source when Jedi needed weapons in a hurry. By the High Republic era, the Jedi had become known for lightsabers that were as much personal expression as they were weapons. That's why the battle saber stands out so clearly. Battle sabers were deliberately simple. They were essentially cylindrical metal hilts designed for speed of production rather than artistry. During the Nile Crisis and the destruction of Starlight Beacon, the Jedi enacted the Guardian Protocols, and suddenly they needed functional weapons fast. Fights were escalating, lightsabers were being lost, and replacements had to be ready for any capable Jedi who needed one. Master Govena assisted others in constructing these sabers, and schematics were even preserved in Professor Huyang's technical manual. What makes this weapon interesting isn't how powerful it was, but how disliked it became. High Republic Jedi were used to sabers that reflected their identity, and the battle saber stripped all of that away, the lightsaber that broke the rules. Few Jedi weapons reflect personal adaptation better than Ezra Bridger's lightsaber blaster. Ezra built this weapon himself after receiving a Kyber crystal at the Jedi Temple on Lothal, using spare parts donated by the Ghost crew. From the start, it wasn't just a lightsaber, it was a hybrid. In lightsaber mode, it functioned as a standard adjustable plasma blade. In blaster mode, it fired stun bolts. Ezra wasn't deflecting blaster fire reliably yet, so instead of forcing himself into a traditional mold, he built himself a weapon that compensated for where he was in his training. That choice paid off. Kanan Jarrus later borrowed Ezra's weapon and used it alongside his own lightsaber to to defeat the Grand Inquisitor. And just as importantly, the weapon didn't last forever. Darth Vader destroyed it during Ezra's duel on Malachor. After that loss, Ezra replaced it with a more traditional green-bladed lightsaber, reflecting his increased confidence and proficiency. When the blade wasn't rigid. Lightsabers are usually defined by precision and control, which is why the light whip feels almost contradictory. Light whips used flexible containment fields instead of rigid plasma blades, which made them far harder to control and gave them less cutting power than a traditional saber. Their history stretches back to the Sith Wars, and they became especially associated with the Night Sisters of Dathomir. But Jedi used them too, because they were effective against forbidden forms of the Sith. High Republic Jedi Knight Vernestra Rwoh modified her own lightsaber to include a whip mode after learning the design through a Force vision. The light whip demanded precision and restraint, and in return it offered versatility. The weapons that changed how Jedi fought. Not every Jedi weapon was meant to replace the lightsaber outright. The lightsaber pike, most famously used by the Jedi Temple Guard, was a staff-shaped weapon with two rare yellow plasma blades projecting from either end. Some versions emitted a single blade that extended the weapon to 2 or 3 meters, and hinged variants also existed. The design emphasized reach, presence, and control, which made it ideal for guarding sacred spaces rather than engaging in personal duels. Darth Bane even had a unique single-bladed version with an extremely long handle, and Luke Skywalker once owned a single-blade variation that was later modified due to damage. Then there's the light foil, a smaller, one-handed lightsaber with a slim blade. Originally created by the Sith of the Mikrosa Order and tied closely to the Makashi combat form, light foils were elegant, lightweight, and balanced. By the Clone Wars, Jedi had largely abandoned them in favour of Shoto sabers. Lower quality light foils could be used by non-Force sensitives, showing how Jedi adjacent technology eventually spread between the Order's control. And at the quieter end of the spectrum, there's the saber cane, a lightsaber concealed within a walking cane. Jedi like Tera Sinube used one during the Clone Wars, and Maul adopted a similar weapon during the reign of the Empire. It wasn't about surprise so much as it was necessity, when Jedi turned weapons into tools. Now for two of the stranger weapons used by the Jedi. The lightsaber rifle, used by Jocasta Nu after the fall of the Jedi Temple, required an actual lightsaber to be loaded into it as fuel. Each rifle could fire several devastating shots before the lightsaber melted beyond use. It could even be set to self-destruct with enough force to tear open the temple walls. Jocasta Nu attempted to use one against Darth Vader, but when it ran out of ammunition and she tried to detonate it telekinetically, Vader redirected the explosion. Even more extreme was the Far Killer, a sniper weapon that used lightsaber technology to eliminate targets from up to 100 kilometers away. Its existence alone was enough to get both its user, Uwap the Apostate, and its creator, Var Will, excommunicated from the Jedi Order. They made a sniper rifle so powerful it got them removed from the Jedi Order. That is something I definitely want to see in live action. Imagine Crosshair got his hands on that. By the way, if this type of Star Wars deep dive is your thing, then stick around, it's basically all we do here. When the Jedi became the weapon. Finally, there were Jedi who abandoned weapons entirely. Shonju, a fallen Padawan turned cult leader, taught himself to channel the Force directly into his hands instead of relying on a lightsaber. He trained others in the same method and even intervened during the Clone Wars. When his betrayal of Aayla Secura cost him both his hands, he later accepted prosthetics that were superior to his originals, continuing his practice. What all of this actually reveals. The Jedi weren't defined by the lightsaber. They were defined by their willingness to adapt it, abandon it, or rebuild it entirely when the situation called for something different. Some of these choices were celebrated, some were rejected, and some crossed the line that the Order could not tolerate. Let me know if any of these weapons surprised you and which one you would use. Personally, I would like to see the Far Killer in action. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe and let's uncover the galaxy's greatest secrets together. Thanks for watching.